Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the effects of these in-groups and out-groups and how they affect us psychologically. So the first one is we have biases around in-groups and out-groups. We tend to assume that members of out-groups are more extreme. I'll talk a minute about status, but this is especially true if the other out-group is a lower status than us. What we will tend to do is take the most extreme members of that group and think of them as the marker of that group in its totality. And this really gets down into stereotypes. Really, what we're doing a stereotype is we are thinking of the outgroup all in terms of one set of traits and attributes. We generalize the outgroup. It just makes it easier. Again, this is a subconscious process that makes it easier for us to have that. I guess it reduces the cognitive load, so we don't have to do as much thinking about each and every person. We place them in an outgroup, and once they're in an outgroup, we can just attribute to that person all of the aspects of the outgroup. And then if we combine that with, we tend to assume that outgroups are more extreme. We also then tend to imagine this person with all the extremity so that then go with them. This is the opposite of what we do with in-groups, where we tend to individuate members of the in-group. And again, this happens as we change the salience of who is in it, of what groups we're part of, and when it's an in-group and when it's an out-group, this changes, right? So when we think about our own group, we tend to see, if we think about our classroom, and we just think about the people in that class, we can think about them each as individuals. But then when we think about the world, say in terms of varsity athletes and NARPs, now we start to stop, we actually stop seeing the opposite group, our out-group members, as individuals, and now we are stereotyping them as part of that out-group instead of seeing them as part of our in-group. This then leads to false attributions. We do have a in-group bias where we have a social motive for self-enhancement. We certainly want to believe that we are better than, frankly, than we are. But that's an important part of being human, is to have some self-esteem. When that breaks down, that's when we run into issues of depression and anxiety, is when we start to break at the clinical level, when we start to break down our belief in ourselves and our own awesomeness. And so that's a natural thing for us to have those beliefs. We believe that we are better than others. And what comes with that, though, is that we believe that our in-group is better than others. We strongly like people who are part of our group, and we tend to negatively evaluate people who are part of the other group. The other thing that can happen here is being a member of an out-group will drive a first impression, even just a group status, right? So I talked about how our first visual idea of a person helps us to place them into a group. Well, if you remember back to the idea that we talked about in NL310 of perceptual set, this idea that I framed the world in a certain way, and then I tend to only see things, that goes to confirmation bias, I only see things that confirm that set, and I tend to ignore other things. Well, now imagine that we put somebody, heuristically, we put somebody into an in-group or an out-group, and then we perceive, even as we start to deal with that person on an individual basis, now we're only perceiving them as a member of that group, and it just reinforces that group status. So our first impressions really drive that group status really importantly. And further, the attribution biases that go into this as well. I don't think I put it on the slide here, but we would tend to have the same problems with attributions that we have about ourselves as individuals. And again, I'm pulling stuff from NL310 here that you may or may not remember from the critical thinking part of the class last year. But what we know is if it goes back to fundamental attribution error and that self-enhancement bias, when I make a mistake, or if I fail for some reason, I tend to attribute that failure to social circumstances or to things that are beyond my control. Whereas when other people fail, I tend to view that as a trait with them, right? I tend to attribute that to something that's wrong with their personality or something that's wrong about them. And look, that's a natural thing. We all do that. That's a fundamental attribution error combined with the self-enhancement bias. It's so fundamental, we call it the fundamental attribution error. So it's a natural thing that happens. Also, that grows up to the group level. So we tend to, when members of our group make mistakes, we tend to look for situational reasons why that is a problem and why that came to be. When people who are outgrouped to us make mistakes, we tend to attribute that to them. And then going back to that extreme thinking, we tend to attribute that failure to the group as a whole rather than to them as an individual and rather than to circumstances that are going on with that. This then has an effect, if we look at our leadership here, this has an effect on our selection biases, like when we actually select people to be members of our group, and also how we rate them. Maybe my best example for this is when you're a squad leader, as many of you are. If you're a squad leader and you have a really good team, you're working with your plebes really well, you know they're doing well, and your plebes show up late to formation. Well, you've identified them. If you're depending on what's salient to you at the time, if your squad is very salient to you, then those plebes are a member of your in-group as being part of that squad. You are more likely to attribute them being late to hey, they usually are fine. Obviously something happened. They had chow calls, or they had, class ran late, or this always happens, and it's fine. It's not really about them. It's just a thing, right? So we would then tend to discard that idea. Whereas when the plebes in the squad behind ours show up late, well, then we start to say, well, man, I don't know what you guys are doing for training in that squad. That's kind of messed up. Now we're attributing it at the individual level. There's something wrong with that leadership. There's something wrong with that group because they were late. And that's what I'm talking about here. And those individual attribution biases then play out with our in-groups and our out-groups. This also has an effect on acceptance of leaders, where we tend to look for leaders who are prototypical of the group. So if we're part of a group, we will look for leaders who look like and act like members of that group. And we will try to avoid people who don't look and act like members of that group. So this can be an important consideration for us, especially as junior officers, as you are trying to arise in leadership. Certainly, we want to maintain the separation of being an officer, but we also want to make sure that people understand that we are part of their group and not part of this kind of outlying group that is separate from them, because that's going to affect our ability to emerge as leaders. So the key takeaway here are, from the last presentation, was we're going to develop in-groups and out-groups. Here we're talking about, and that has an effect on how we evaluate people and how we think about people is because of their in-group or out-group membership. So that's something we need to be aware of. In addition, groups have different status, right? And I think we fundamentally understand this idea. This is about pecking order. This is about some groups having higher status than others. And obviously this happens in a demographic way. We certainly know from sociology that white male are the highest status group. This tends to be followed actually by black male, and then white female, and then finally black female. And again, I'm kind of ignoring some of the other demographic groups here because those are the two largest that we tend to do these studies about. But there is this social order, this pecking order. But this occurs not just on a demographic basis. This also occurs in all of our other areas as well. We had a instructor in our department a few years ago who was an F-14 pilot, so it's obviously quite a few years ago. He was an F-14 pilot, but he would talk about during the Gulf War, and when he talked about the Gulf War, he meant the first one. They had kind of the A squad and the B squad. So within their squadron, they had the really good pilots, and then the not bad pilots, but just kind of the B team. And the A team pilots were the ones who went out over Iraq and would drop bombs and do ground support and whatever else. And the B team pilots were assigned to do carrier air patrols and stay close to the carrier and do that kind of work. And really what develops from a situation like that is now you have these two status groups. It's very clear that the A team, it's literally the A team, right? That is a higher status group than the B team is a lower status group. Now that has an implication for how people talk about each other, how people think about each other. These statuses among subgroups really make a difference. Now, what's interesting there is when you're a part of a high status group, that's where you tend to talk about colorblindness. That's when you start to talk about, oh, we're all just part of one team. I don't know why these distinctions even matter. And you just ignore those group differences, even though they actually exist and you kind of know they exist. When you're part of a lower status group, then you become more aware of this pecking order. And you're more willing to talk about these differences in the pecking order and these status differences because they're having an impact on you. Now, there's also an interesting case of a lower status member of higher status groups. They tend to be very aware of status as well. And higher status member of lower status groups tend to be, they're very aware of the status differences, but they really do everything they can to identify with that higher status group, whereas lower status members of lower status groups are very happy, well, not happy, but they're very loud about, no, we are a different group, we are different status, it's really important to maintain our identity, etc. Look, there's an entire, probably semester where we could talk about the status differences among groups and the effects that they have. What I want you to understand as leaders is this pecking order is going to naturally develop as subgroups develop, and you need to make sure you're paying attention to that. What's really important here is the idea of the leaders in group. And the idea that sometimes the leader shows favoritism towards a particular group. And if the leader is not careful, it's about people who are in their own demographic group, even moreover. So when the leader plays favorites towards a particular group, they are seen then as part of the leaders in group. And that automatically gives them higher status. That's going to give them status just by virtue of doing that. And it's going to be perceived as very unfair. And you're really going to develop some issues across the board. So you got to be very aware of your influence on the status among groups and how it can actually make things worse in that way.